revision notes on the opening of Stave 1, Marley's Ghost. So Dickens actually begins the novel with a preface where he says, "I have endeavoured in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea which shall not put my readers out of humour with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly, and no one wish to lay it." So he introduces to the reader several ideas here. Firstly, it is a ghostly tale, which is also verified by the title of Stave 1, Marley's Ghost. Secondly, he intends it to be specifically for the season, for Christmas. It is a Christmas story, and we have certainly come to associate it now with the Christmas message of being benevolent and good and kind to those around us. And really importantly, it is to raise the ghost of an idea. Now, that idea that Dickens wants to be introduced to his reader is about being more philanthropic, looking after those who are perhaps poorer or have less than we do, being a benevolent, good, moral individual, particularly at this time of year when we have so much to give. However, the opening of the first stave is actually rather dramatic and shocking, not at all what we'd expect from a Christmas story. It begins with the very short sentence, "Marley was dead," which really emphasises this fact, but then goes on to state, "to begin with," creating suspense and perhaps implying that he will return in some form later on in the novel, which indeed he does by the end of the chapter, to haunt Scrooge. However, Dickens deliberately emphasises the fact of his death. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail, where the simile seems to emphasise the finality of his demise in a rather humorous way. He goes on to repeat this. "You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail," and even, "there is no doubt that Marley was dead." However, these references are rather undercut by the allusion to Hamlet and Hamlet's father, who haunts him at the beginning of Shakespeare's play in order to encourage him to get revenge for his murder, which again anticipates the return of Marley's ghost later in the novel and builds a sense of unease and suspense right from the very beginning of the text. We also learn a great deal about Scrooge from his attitude to Marley and connection with him. We are informed they were business partners for many years, and in fact Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole odd-sign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and sole mourner, where the repetition of that adjective emphasises Marley's isolation and loneliness. He has no other friends, no family. Scrooge is the only one to attend the funeral. And yet, despite this, Scrooge seems to have little real concern for Marley, again reflecting his rather inhuman, cold characteristics. On the very day of his funeral, he returns to business, which is considered in his mind to be more important than friendship or any kind of emotional engagement. Nor is he bothered to remove Marley's name from their business door. In fact, he keeps the name as it is, Scrooge and Marley, and answered to both names. It was all the same to him, again reflecting a rather callous disregard for human interaction. He seems to feel no sadness or mourning for his supposed friend. The next description we gain of Scrooge is very telling and also reflects the author's judgment, who often intervenes. We see this at the very beginning when the author tells us that there would be nothing more remarkable in Hamlet's father taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon his own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out of dark in a breezy spot, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm about to relate. So we get the sense of a narrator who is telling us a story as if round a fireside, and is therefore omniscient and able to intervene and tell us things about the characters and how they are thinking and feeling that we otherwise wouldn't be able to know. Certainly this first description of Scrooge is the most important and reveals a great deal about him. We're told he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, where the image there suggests somebody who is cold and who works those around him excessively, including the likes of Bob Cratchit, as if grinding them down, squeezing them dry of their last ounce of energy, all for the sake of money. We then get a series of terms: squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, where the list creates a build-up of the impression that Scrooge is money-grabbing, avaricious and cruel, taking every opportunity to squeeze the last ounce of wealth from those around him. He is also described as hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out a generous fire. Again, this simile suggests someone who is cold and callous, somebody with little regard for human interaction, who is almost inhuman. He is also secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster, with a wonderful ominous sibilance there that makes him sound rather snake-like perhaps. And that simile is important because it emphasises how closed off Scrooge is. Like an oyster, he is contained within himself, refusing to involve himself with the world around him. And the reason for that is his money. And the oyster, and the way it contains a pearl inside, it is almost as if Scrooge contains his money within him, keeps it all to himself in this miserly fashion, never sharing it with others, and indeed never even using it on himself. He is also repeatedly associated with the cold. The cold within him froze his old features. His lips are blue. A frosty rime was on his head. He carried his own low temperature always about him. So he is repeatedly associated through this Lexis with the idea of being icy, of being hard, of being almost inhuman, having no feeling, either physically or indeed emotionally. Even in the winter, there is virtually no fire or warmth in the counting house, and the counting house, indeed, where this is set, very much epitomises Scrooge, a place of money dealing, a place where the most important thing is material wealth, and there is little room for any affection or jollity. In fact, he enjoys this solitary isolation that is self-inflicted. People around him acknowledge this. Even poor beggars don't approach him. Even blind men's dogs appear to know not to go near him. And yet it was the very thing he liked, Dickens tells us, as if deliberately warding off human contact as something that is beneath him. The story proper then begins at the bottom of page 2 with Once Upon a Time, again suggesting this is going to have a rather fairy tale quality, hopefully with a happy ending and including some kind of transformation, which by the end of the novel we will indeed see in Scrooge. It is Christmas Eve, a time we would expect of generosity and benevolence, although these are qualities that we do not yet see in Scrooge. The whole novel obviously is set in London, and Dickens gives us a strong impression of London through the description of it being foggy, quite dark, the air is brown, the fog comes pouring in, and this reminds us of the Victorian smog. But it's also important in creating the atmosphere, this rather uneasy, sinister, foreboding atmosphere. He employs pathetic fallacy in describing the houses opposite as mere phantoms, suggesting something haunting and disturbing. The cloud is obscuring everything, and nature itself is brewing on a large scale, almost like a kind of witch's brew, suggesting something ominous and perhaps forewarning us of the appearance of the ghosts later. Meanwhile, Scrooge remains in his counting house, Bob in his little cell, beyond a sort of tank, implying his imprisonment, and Scrooge himself keeping a mercurial eye over his employee, making sure he doesn't take any more coal than he is allowed. This whole scene, however, is interrupted by the appearance of Fred. And Fred is in juxtaposition to Scrooge, jovial, warm. One of the first adjectives used to describe him is in fact cheerful. He comes in and he's been walking and he's all in a glow. He's ruddy and handsome. His eyes sparkled. So all of these verbs suggest someone full of warmth, full of vigour, full of energy, the opposite of Scrooge. And what Fred epitomises is the Christmas spirit. He is in many ways in this section Dickens' mouthpiece, revealing his attitude to Christmas and how we should treat others. We gain a strong sense of Fred's character, not merely in the jovial way in which he greets his uncle despite his rather dismissive attitude towards him, but also in his expressive attitude towards Christmas. To him, Christmas is not about profit and not about getting the most he can from the season, but rather he sees it as a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and think of people below them as if they were really fellow passengers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on their journeys. So, to him, it is a time when we should be benevolent, we should be giving to others, we should be helping those who are less fortunate. It's a time to embody the kind of Christmas spirit, which is about generosity and morality. And he demonstrates this himself by inviting Scrooge to dine with us tomorrow, and insisting the simple reason for that is that he wants to be friends. He wants to open the arms of friendship. He wants to embody the sense of community and family that to him epitomises Christmas. And this is also demonstrated by his attitude towards his marriage. Scrooge questions why he should ever have got married, because it brings no profit. And his simple response is, because I fell in love. Again revealing that to him, to Fred, human interaction, emotion, the importance of family is far more important than material gain. Of course, we see the opposite being the case for Scrooge. And in juxtaposition to Fred, he describes Christmas in a negative way. Out upon Christmas, he says. As far as he is concerned, it's a time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer. Again, repeatedly associating Christmas with money and potentially the money he will lose. He regards anyone who enjoys Christmas as an idiot, and even suggests they should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart, which is rather a violent, sadistic image that reflects not merely his rejection of Christmas, but his disgust with the whole notion and his hardness of heart. He is even described to have growled at his nephew, conveying a rather animalistic, inhuman impression of Scrooge once again. And rather than embracing this offer of a Christmas dinner with family, he merely repeatedly responds, "Good afternoon," where those repeated exclamations suggest his rather aggressive, dismissive attitude to the one person who has demonstrated generosity and warmth to him. The next characters we encounter who meet Scrooge are two gentlemen, so presumably well-off individuals, who have come asking for people to contribute to charity at this time of year. And again, much like Fred, they seem to reflect Dickens' attitude to both Christmas and the fact that we should be more generous to others and to be looking after the poor. They point out to Scrooge that many thousands are in want of common necessaries, hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, reminding the reader that there are thousands of individuals who have very little at Christmas, who are suffering, who are living in poverty, on the streets, struggling, which would have been far, far more widespread in Victorian England, and we see some of that suffering and poverty in the Cratchit family. They suggest, therefore, that Scrooge give a small amount to charity to help the poor, to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. It doesn't sound like a great deal to ask. And they say we choose this time of year, Christmas in particular, when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. And Dickens personifies want and abundance there. Abundance is about having more than enough, having almost an excessive amount, whereas want, the very opposite, is about need. And in fact, we will meet the personified figure of want much later in the novel. Unsurprisingly, Scrooge reveals himself to be utterly malicious and malevolent in his response to these individuals. He questions, are there no prisons? And the union workhouses, the treadmill and the poor law are in full vigour then? And he is pleased by this. And it is important to remember that prisons in Victorian England were atrocious places. They were places where children and adults alike went, and where they were forced into silence virtually the entire time, where the food was incredibly meagre, the conditions were atrocious, and they had to engage in hard labour, things including working on the treadmill, where they would work for 10 minutes on, 5 minutes off, for 8 hours non-stop, back-breaking, arduous work intended to break the spirit of individuals and act as a deterrent to other criminals. But bear in mind that many of these individuals had stolen a loaf of bread in desperation. Likewise, the union workhouses were despised institutions. They had been brought into place by the Poor Law Act of 1834, and they were intended to force people into the workhouses if they had nowhere else to go, and people only went out of desperation, and many died there. Men and women were separated, children and adults were separated, so families were entirely split up, and the conditions were atrocious. Food was meagre, the bedding was virtually non-existent, and again they had to endure back-breaking work, things like literally breaking stones in order to be there. So these are the things that Scrooge says, well, can't they just go and do that? Utterly dismissive, a callous disregard for human suffering. Perhaps worse still, he simply says when the men suggest but they could die there, if they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population, echoing the views of Thomas Malthus, that really suggests human life to Scrooge has little value. If they are not working, they are beneath him, and as far as he is concerned, quite literally, they could die. So a really misanthropic attitude, a cruel, callous attitude that we are meant to find appalling and meant to condemn in Scrooge. And of course the poor gentlemen get sent on their way. The next individuals we encounter, we get a wonderful description of kind of the activity in the London streets outside, which of course Scrooge does not participate in, this glorious pageant where everyone else, in contrast to Scrooge, is enjoying the festive season. And as it gets foggier yet and colder, one small boy who is cold and hungry and desperate puts his head into the letterbox, I suppose, and regales Scrooge with a Christmas carol of God bless you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay. Scrooge's response is again violent, vitriolic. Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror. No, this is a complete rejection of all things really that Christmas stands for. We're told he possesses an ill will and is angry even at this small interruption of the Christmas spirit. He does, however, agree that Bob can have the following day off, it being Christmas Day. Many people would only have had things like Christmas Day off throughout the year. There were no kind of holidays in the way we have now of people being allowed so many weeks off a year in order to go on holiday. That was simply unheard of. So this is a rare opportunity. And yet Scrooge begrudges Bob even this, claiming it's not fair. If I was to stop £0.50 for it, you'd think yourself ill-used. So again, illustrating this rather miserly nature. As Bob points out, it's only once a year. And of course, Scrooge growls in response. And Bob's attitude and his feelings for Christmas, again, much like Fred's, juxtapose those of Scrooge. And despite the fact that Bob evidently has so little, we're told he boasted no great coat, for example. This is somebody who lives in poverty really himself with his family. He is joyous, exuberant, and almost childlike as he runs home. We're told he went down a slide on Cornhill at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honour of its being Christmas Eve. He is so excited to spend time with his family, to be part of a community. He runs home to play at blind man's buff, again reminding us that this is an individual who cares for his family and is a good father figure. Again, in contrast to Scrooge, who has rejected these very things in refusing to spend time with Fred, who is his nephew. Meanwhile, Scrooge himself dines alone. He took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, the repetition of that term emphasising his isolation and his depressive state. And this is a choice he is making. He then returns to his gloomy suite of rooms. There is a rather grave-like sobriety about the place, almost as if it reflects Scrooge's very character. Nobody else lives there. In fact, the rest of the building is let out for offices, so it is utterly isolated. He is cut off from society by choice. And everything about it is dark. He has to grope to find the doorway. The genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. So there is something rather glowering and unpleasant, something even malevolent about this place, so that is mirrored in Scrooge's own character, and also perhaps metaphorically reflects his blindness to the real values in life, and his moral blindness in the way we have seen him behave throughout this chapter. And really that opening of that chapter is all about establishing Scrooge's character. It's shown through the setting, it's shown through the language he uses, such as that repetition of bah, humbug, that is now a kind of stereotypical catchphrase for a miserly individual. It's shown by the way in which his own home reflects his persona. It's shown by the imagery Dickens uses, and it's shown in the way he is juxtaposed to other characters who do embody the Christmas spirit and do show morality and generosity regardless of their circumstances. And the importance of establishing Scrooge's character in that way in the opening is that later we can see him change, and in the next part of the chapter we perhaps begin to see some of that change, or at least certainly why he will change.